Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for the hospitality. As I said before the lecture, I've been having an absolutely wonderful time, and it's a delight to get to come here and to get to hear about the research that you guys are doing. It's such an exciting place to see geography and media studies coming together in this way. And I picked today's talk. I have to confess I had some anxiety when the invitation came in because I haven't been doing a lot of media work lately. And so I decided to dip back into the near past to talk about a book I published a few years ago, which I didn't really think of as a kind of media-related project, but in some ways it's exactly about media. And so I've tried to bend it a little bit in your direction today, but I'm hopeful that we can have a really interesting discussion afterwards and try to think about this project in terms of geomedia. The book that this talk is a kind of brief synopsis of is called Diplomatic Material, Affect, Assemblage, and Foreign Policy. And it was very much aimed kind of towards, to some extent, political geographers, but really kind of international relations and diplomacy studies as a way of trying to bring through stuff that I had kind of learned working in the realm of kind of media and cultural studies. So hopefully you'll find it fruitful. So to the long, pretentious quote that every lecture must start. This is from A Tale of Two Cities, which I happened to be reading around the same time that I was writing Diplomatic Material. And it's a quote that's referring to the French Revolution, right? Dickens's discussion of the French Revolution. He was pretty skeptical of it, as many English people were. But he wrote, "Who gave them out? Whence they last came? Where they began? Through what agency they crookedly quivered and jerked, scores at a time, over the heads of the crowd, like a kind of lightning. No eye in the throng could have told. But muskets were being distributed, and so were cartridges, powder, and all, bars of iron and wood, knives, axes, pikes, every weapon that distracted ingenuity could discover or devise. People who could lay hold of nothing else set themselves with bleeding hands to force stones and bricks out of their places in walls. Every pulse and heart in Saint Antoine was on high fever strain and at high fever heat. Every living creature there held life as of no account and was demented with a passionate readiness to sacrifice it." So what I love about this quote, besides the fact that he's obviously a better writer than I am, and so better to have his prose on the screen than mine, is he's, to me, getting at really the relationship between kind of a mob, which is a distinct kind of human formation, and affect, and the materials, the environment that the mob finds themselves in, right? That the violence itself is possible both because of the materials that the mob is able to work with, but also that there is no leader, right? It begins by saying, you know, this is all kind of just happening. And that made me think, as a kind of scholarly intervention, it made me think to the way I felt during the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which I was in the United States for, and which you felt like, you know, you could feel the kind of almost mob mentality building. You knew the war was going to happen before it actually started. You know, people were trying to stop it, but you knew it wasn't going to work. There was a sense of kind of momentum or force going through both the US state and US society, which sort of could not be debated with. And so I kind of wanted to think through in a lot of ways with this project, how is it that something like, this is a very broad brush objective, but how is it that something like the war in Iraq can happen, or why does it happen when there are so many arguments against it? And I think it's helpful to kind of push us to think about a politics that is more about the passion, the mob, than about discourse and rationality, which is often how we think about it. And so the book is really an effort to think about diplomacy in this sense, right? To think about diplomacy not in the ways that it's often discussed as a kind of rational exchange of views, a kind of cold and calculating set of actors who each have well-defined aims and they're looking for some common ground, or to win the debate, to dominate the other, to bring them around to their point of view. that this is a kind of elite-centric notion of diplomacy, very anthropocentric, right? Its focus is entirely on the people in the room, which has dominated diplomacy studies for a long time. And so I thought, what if we think about diplomacy not just as the people who connect different governments, which I might add is only one way to think about diplomacy. There's a lot of non-state diplomacies that are out there, but for the moment, starting with the basics, what if we thought about diplomacy as any point of connection between government apparatuses, across different states? And here you can maybe see my interest is thinking about diplomacy as a form of mediation. And I think this wider set of definitions can really bring to light all sorts of connections, all sorts of relations, all sorts of mediations between different foreign policy apparatuses. So it's not just an ambassador meeting an ambassador or a head of state meeting a head of state, but instead it's not even just the really low-level bureaucrats who might meet up across state lines. Although, of course, that is diplomacy as well. But it's also about things like shared databases or design standardization and all of these material connections that link different foreign policy apparatuses together. And so I cheekily wrote here, diplomatic geomedia, perhaps, is a way of thinking about that. But you can tell me if I'm being too generous in my interpretation of the center's remit. And so all of these points of connection are important because they enable the circulation of things, whether it's data, whether it is affect, whether it is actual flows of materials, seem very important these days in terms of the war in Ukraine. And that those existing circulations, right, these things are already existing in various ways when political leaders go to make a decision. The political leaders are themselves ensconced in these assemblages, and so their political subjectivities are being reworked by these existing changes in circulation, right? That affects flowing through material channels work their way up in some form to shape decision-making processes. And I like this because in some ways it's really decentering either the lead diplomats or the heads of state or the foreign ministers or whoever you're interested in. It's instead looking at the assemblages that they find themselves at the top of and saying, how do those assemblages shape the way that these people are viewing the world? And I think this is important because there is a long tradition in both punditry and in certain parts of international relations that looks at these things through civilizational lenses, right? It looks to document the sort of blocks in the world or alliances in the world and interpret them through these kind of macro-cultural lenses, right? So one of them that's in this document is, in this book, is the Anglosphere, right? The idea that there is the kind of English-speaking world, and in particular, the bits that were the UK and its settler colonies, right? So this map here or this flag is someone's rendition of what the flag of the Anglosphere might look like. You might also think about Europe this way, right? That there are these kind of racial or linguistic or, insert your axis of difference here, things that make for civilizations, right? Famously, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis was built on this. And, I think without thinking about it too much, it's easy to see how, convenient those labels are. But what I tried to do in this research is to show a different avenue for why those outcomes might come to be, besides just saying, oh, well, these people flock together. And actually, I think historically, we can see these moments of rupture where these groups didn't have to come together. And so I'll try to give you some examples of these moments where different kinds of material diplomacy help to bring these assemblages together. So, empirically, the book has 4 chapters. If you're interested, the book is very short. I will make a recommendation for those of you who are earlier career scholars. A book doesn't have to be really a certain length before it counts as a book. So if you want to write a very long book, you're welcome to do so. But You could write 2 short books in that amount of time, and you'll find yourself with a longer CV very quickly. So that was my approach here. It was described by one of its reviewers as a novella, which I actually took as quite a compliment. So it has 4 empirical chapters, 1 introduction, 1 conclusion in addition. And they trace different assemblages in which the UK is enmeshed. So the first one in here, pictured in the top left, is what we would think of as traditional diplomacy. And the case study is about the 19th century Foreign Office, which is the British Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And with an eye towards the building that houses it, actually apropos of some of our discussions about work environments today, I studied a series of debates about what diplomacy was like at the time and what they thought it would look like in the future, because they were going to build a building for the Foreign Office, and they wanted to future-proof it. And so that was a very interesting avenue through which for me to explore the materials of diplomacy. And I'll give you some anecdotes from that in a little bit. But in terms of what the boxes mean, that's traditional diplomacy, as you might think of it. The next box in the kind of bottom left is, that's actually a picture of a building that's affectionately known as the Donut in the UK. It is GCHQ, which is the Signals Intelligence Agency. And this is to represent what's called now the Five Eyes Alliance, which you may have heard of. It is the Anglosphere, shall we say, of the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And it's a unique signals intelligence sharing partnership in the world. I don't think there is any partnership that is anywhere near as deep as this one. It started, you might say, really during World War II and just never stopped. And so this is an alliance in which, in theory, if not completely in practice, all signals intelligence is shared and all technological developments are shared. There is essentially one big supranational intelligence agency that has branch offices in Cheltenham, England, Fort Meade, Maryland, which is the National Security Agency, and then I'd be lying if I could tell you where all the rest are. They're much smaller. But here we have a true kind of supranational intelligence assemblage. And so how did this develop and what effects did it have? In the upper right corner, there'll be one perhaps particularly of interest to people in this country, given current political events. We have NATO. And here, my interest is not NATO in general, but the development of what's called interoperability. And interoperability is a concept that is about how do different military forces work together. And it could be used within a nation, and sometimes the term is used to describe, can, for instance, the Army and the Navy fight together, right? Not against each other, I should say, but with each other, right? How interoperable are their forces, or are they just two separate things that can't work together? And so countries for a long time have tried to work together or to coordinate interoperability. But after World War II, when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, there was the question of how do you get different countries' militaries to all fight well together? Because the concept they were facing, of course, was a very fragmented Western Europe with distant allies across the Atlantic. So lots of different small military forces facing off against the Soviet Union, which had one big military bureaucracy, right? So presumably no problems of interoperability. How do you get all these small countries to fight as one? And that was the challenge they were facing. So I'll talk about the development of interoperability in more detail in a few minutes. And then the last one, which is a sort of tragic one for me, I did this research just prior to the Brexit vote. And so my study there was about the Foreign Office and its relationship to European External Action Service. So how is it that UK foreign policy formation was shaped by its already existing participation in the European External Action Service? And of course, this chapter became outdated within about 1 year. I mean, we all hope our research doesn't date too quickly, but I'll tell you should aim for a shelf life of more than a year, because it was all done shortly thereafter. And so in looking at these kinds of, what I would say, 4 different kinds of diplomacies, 4 different ways in which the British foreign policy apparatus, or apparatuses, were enmeshed in ongoing international relationships, right? And how is it that then we can think of that as a set of material flows which then shape the British perception of its own interests, right? That national interests aren't pre-existing things, but they emerge out of certain material environments. And so this kind of, each chapter being a different case study, is meant to be an attempt to read across multiple assemblages all at once. Okay, so how is it we can think about it as already enmeshed in the international community, which is a kind of broad term that includes responsible state actors. It's obviously a loaded term. Historically, those who were granted access to the diplomatic community were understood to be the civilized nations, right? There were nations that were fit for colonizing. There were ones who you would give diplomatic recognition to. So we can think of this as not a universal community, but as a kind of normative community, the international community. How about the Anglosphere for the Five Eyes network? How about the West, which is very much how NATO is framed? And then finally, Europe. These are 4 different kind of communities, what might be argued to be civilizational communities, but which I'm here arguing are actually emerging out of these different kind of bureaucratic enmeshings. So that's the kind of empirical structure of the book. But what I want to kind of spend my time on today, and hopefully do some storytelling, I think I have about 28 minutes left, is 4 cross-cutting themes from the book. Because I thought telling you one little bit of each chapter doesn't sound very good. Telling you one chapter doesn't seem like it really gets across the point of the book. So I went with the 4 cross-cutting themes. So one is the concept of protocol, and here I'm linking it with Deleuze's notion of puissance. So puissance is a form of power that is about pulling a community together, right? It's about, in some ways, shaping a group. You know, you could think about even this lecture theater as an example of puissance, right? It's materially laid out in a way to provide a focal point for me, and you are all you're obviously not required to listen to what I'm saying, but it presupposes that I'm going to be talking and you're going to be listening, and therefore the things I say and do are going to be shaping the way you feel, right? You'll be affectively responding to me. Of course, you're also affectively responding to each other in various ways, but it's being channeled in particular ways, right? And so there's the kind of power of producing the group. Then the next cross-cutting theme is, so I'll talk about protocols and the way that they work to produce puissance or to shape puissance. Then I want to talk a bit about hierarchy and pouvoir. And pouvoir is another notion of power that Deleuze talks about, which is essentially kind of like power too. Once you've created this community, what do you want to do with it, right? So you might think of puissance is almost like internalist or producing the community, and pouvoir is about kind of directing it outward, right? And so and that requires direction, right? So that's hence my interest in hierarchy. How is it that in a kind of in a community you formed, that then you can direct the energy of that group to do something? I'll spend most of my time doing examples from those two, because to be honest with you, they're the most fun for me. I'll briefly talk about negotiating difference, because I'm really keen to point out and to show that this is not, one of the stories of globalization that people talk about is that it's about homogenization, right? And here I kind of want to make sure we're not talking about that when we talk about the production of these things, that actually all of these different communities accommodate difference in one way or another, some of them more so than others, but there remains difference within. And then finally, I want to talk about capabilities and vulnerabilities, because often the narrative of both assemblage theory and also of these kind of large supranational groups is that they are inexorable, right? What's Thanos from, he says, I'm inevitable, right? And there's a certain kind of inevitableness to the power that's attributed to these groups. And what I want to show is that, of course, these groups are highly capable, and that, for instance, pouvoir is about acting out in the world and doing things. But but that also essentially any ability to do that then entails vulnerabilities, right? It is not some abstract power nowhere. It is always grounded somewhere and therefore has material vulnerabilities. So this is the aim for the rest of the lecture. I hope to keep you entertained and amused throughout. So let's start with protocol. What is protocol? Well, this is President Bill Clinton wrote the introduction to a book about diplomatic protocol. It was written by his chief protocol person, so I think it was a retirement favor by Bill. So he says, protocol evolves in step with our transition to interdependence. By upholding traditions, acknowledging customs, and maintaining appropriate formalities in our interactions with other nations, we convey respect and order, helping to create an environment conducive to mutual understanding and collaborative decision-making. There's a kind of a nice synopsis here of what the aim is, right? The aim of diplomatic protocol, all the formalities, the 21-gun salutes, the 18-gun salutes, knowing who gets 21, who gets 18, who gets a red carpet, who doesn't. All of these things which are easily mockable, right? I mean, you could say, who cares? That's not real politics, right? The real politics happens when you're in the room. But that actually, all of that ritual and all of that signifying is about setting up an affective environment in which that politics can happen. As he says, we convey respect and order, right? We help to create an environment conducive to mutual understanding and collaborative decision-making, right? If you get them wrong, right, then you show you haven't cared about the other side enough to get them right. And that's already then setting things up badly. So all of those, what we might think of as human procedural things, right, which are about meeting them at the plane, having the soldiers, at attention and all that stuff. It's very much about orienting bodies in a way that, conveys this atmosphere. But there are non-human protocols as well. And so I thought I would go to a different definition of protocol, which weirdly we probably all of us have more experience with. I got this out of this quote out of a textbook on TCP/IP protocols. I have to promise to say I didn't read the whole book, but I found a good definition and stole it. Protocol is a set of rules, algorithms, messages, and other mechanisms that enable software and hardware in network devices to communicate effectively. Right? It's a non-human, digital, or often physical design. Right? If you think about like the USB plug and all our controversies. I mean, right now I've got 3 plugs hanging off of this so that we can plug anybody's laptop into the system, right? Because at the moment you need 3. It used to be you needed like 5. We seem to be consolidating towards USB-C, right? So there's digital protocols, and then there's the physical design of like how do you get systems to plug into each other, right? You can think of like if you have a diesel car and you try to put unleaded in it, right? And they just physically won't go in because they've shaped the thing so that you can't do it, right? So there's a physical design protocol as well of how you can make things fit together or not. And here you can see how getting the protocols right can shape the outcomes in all sorts of ways, or you can foster certain kinds of atmospheres and foster or fail to foster the one you're hoping for. So protocols can be either embodied practices, they can be material things, but either way, they enable the generation of puissance, right, of constitutive power. But so let's talk about one here in specifics, right? This machine, I won't expect anyone to recognize it. It's not a 20th century typewriter from a workspace. Oh, I guess it is kind of, actually. That's actually exactly what it is. But it's a very specific kind of typewriter. This is called the combined cipher machine. And the story I want to tell you about it is from World War II. And so in World War I, the United States and the UK had collaborated with intelligence at various points. They were allies. They would occasionally pass on information to the other side, but they remained entirely separate. And it was kind of like as and when you thought it was worthwhile, you would pass on some information to the other side. They were very skeptical of each other, right? The US was late to join the war. There was very little reason to think they were going to stick around, and they were right, actually, as it turns out. This was, at various points, the UK and the US had been enemies, right? As all through the 19th century. For instance, Britain was quite supportive of the Confederacy during the American Civil War, right? This was not what we would now recognize as the US-UK relationship. So when World War I was over, they went their separate ways. World War II came around, and things were a little different. Maybe the UK was a bit more desperate, I don't know. Very similar story, though, of essentially trying to help each other out when possible. But there was still skepticism of each other. But the environment had changed quite a bit, right? And the Germans had developed their kind of coding system, which is actually very similar to the one that we have here. And the US and UK decided to collaborate on trying to crack the German codes, because obviously both of them were really interested in cracking the German codes. And this was kind of the kind of thing that required mathematicians and really drove a lot of our development of computer technology at the time. And so they decided to help each other out. Now, the interesting thing about trying to join in together on the research project was that if you were trying to jointly crack the code with the other guy, you very quickly became aware of the other side's capabilities, right? Because, if they can't figure out to crack it for this reason, but you could, then they don't have this technology that you have, and so on. So the cooperation there actually started to initially make things a lot more transparent. You knew the technological and mathematical capabilities of the other side. And so that actually weirdly starts to generate trust, because you become aware of each other's vulnerabilities. You made yourself vulnerable to the other side in a way, right? And you obviously also have a joint purpose. Then they decided to share during wartime all of the intercepted signals that they got, right? So all the radio signals that they tracked down would get passed over to the other side, and they would go to these joint centers for code cracking and so on. It became a joint endeavor. And the reason I have a picture of this is because this is, and the reason it's called the combined cipher machine is because essentially what they did at one point is if you're going to pass on the German intelligence from, let's just say, the UK to the US, you have to have a coded channel to do that in, right? Because you can't just broadcast it, obviously. And so that requires you to share your codes. And this machine here, if you can see those 5 little dashes up here, those are the flywheels. The way this machine works is every time, and the German machine worked kind of similarly, every time you're typing your message, it spins the flywheel so that, let's just say you hit the letter D, it might get translated as an E in the code. The next time you hit the letter D, it's going to be something else. And you have to have this kind of progressive flywheel to understand what the code is. So the combined cipher machine essentially took all the codes out that were used before, and the UK and the US started using the same flywheels. It became basically impossible to keep secrets from one another. And again, this starts to build the trust, right? You become fully aware of each other's code breaking abilities. You are using the same codes, and so on. And eventually, for complicated reasons, Australia and Canada and New Zealand became involved in this towards the end of the war as well. And after the war, because they very quickly went from trying to crack the German codes to trying to crack the Soviet codes, they decided to keep the old band together, right? And so they just stuck it out, and it became institutionalized as the Five Eyes Alliance. And it has existed to this day. It only became publicly known in 2010. I think it was 2010, although there were some rumors obviously before that, but it was one of the kind of great secrets of the Cold War. So what does it mean to be sharing intelligence in this way? If you've been following the news, you know that like when there's a leak of intelligence, which seems to happen every 5-10 years these days, from some 20-year-old contractor, the US does the leak, but it's UK documents that come out in it, right? Because there is functionally no distinction they're basically getting paid by different groups, but they're all working together. And that intelligence that they produce comes up to all 5 countries, leaders in the daily intelligence briefing or whatever. It's not labeled as American intelligence or British intelligence or Australian intelligence. It's just the intelligence, right? So the leaders can't even say, well, I don't trust those guys. I'm going with the US intelligence. It is all one big report, right? Undifferentiated. So think about how does that then shape the kind of decision making that happens at the top, right? You're already internalizing through the digestion process of this intelligence that there is a collective interest, so to speak, right? That the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, are all jointly working on this, in the world. Another example of puissance and protocol is from NATO. This is a quote I found in the UK National Archives. I mentioned NATO is a collective security organization formed after World War II, basically to prepare for a potential war with the Soviets. I'm glossing over a lot there, but roll with me if you would. And remember, collective security was the idea of the League of Nations, and it pretty famously hadn't worked. So the idea that these countries were all going to go to war if one of them was invaded was pretty tendentious at the time, right? Did people really think that if, let's just say Italy was invaded by the Soviet Union, that the US was going to go to war on their behalf, right? There's good reason to wonder about that, especially given that the US had been so late to the game in the previous 2 world wars. And so they decided that they had to start to work on interoperability. That this was a way to try and stitch the community together, but it didn't go well. And indeed, Dwight Eisenhower, who, after being the Supreme Allied Commander during the war in Europe, and before he was US President, served as the first Supreme Commander of NATO. And he wrote that in Allied capitals, there is considerable confusion and frustration resulting from failure to reach decisions on types of weapons to be manufactured. Some expeditious solution in a number of specific instances is essential if we are to recreate national enthusiasm for an intensified defense effort. So in other words, if the countries couldn't even agree on some of the things to make interoperable, if nobody wanted to budge from the way they did it before, everybody just wanted to keep building their own planes and tanks and bullets and so on, why would you even think these people would go to war with you? And why do you think it would be effective? Because remember, the point of interoperability was to make a more effective military. And so there was a concerted effort made to start small. And the first thing to be standardized was the NATO standard round. So the idea was if all the armies in NATO could agree to use the same bullet, then that means any country could resupply the other country, right? Excuse me. But there the arguments were whose bullet, which bullet? Everybody of course had a vested interest in their bullet getting taken up. It's less work if you don't have to change your bullet. Everyone else has to get new guns. You don't have to. And the main debate was between the US bullet, which in classic American fashion was bigger, heavier, tougher, and the British bullet, which was smaller, kind of tiny. But Britain was already working at standardizing the bullets with all of its Commonwealth allies, right? So they were already invested in a process in which their bullet was going to get taken up by the new countries of like India, Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Britain was still envisioning itself leading that group. And so they didn't want to give up on their bullet. And the Americans were like, we're the Americans. You can have our bullet if you want it. You can get it one way or the other. And eventually they decided on the US bullet. But there were all sorts of implications. I want to make clear the bullet isn't just the bullet, okay? The bullet entails, for instance, retraining all the bodies, right? Because US soldiers were taught to, and I'm not a gun person, so please don't expect me to explain this very well, but because they had bigger, heavier bullets, you would aim and shoot 2, 3, 4 times and then stop and re-aim, because the bullets were so heavy it would move the gun, and you wouldn't, so after 4 bullets you're no longer aiming where you started, right? So American soldiers were trained that way. British soldiers were told to kind of aim and just hold down the button and let the bullets go, because the smaller bullets meant you were still aiming. So the bullet kind of then follows through into the way bodies are entrained and worked in highly disciplined ways to wage warfare. But when they agreed on the US bullet, Britain finally caved, and this became the NATO standard round. And then that allowed you to then start to work on other interoperabilities. So for instance, should we have standard guns? Should we have adapters for different kinds of cartridges that could go into the guns? And so it triggered a whole set of secondary decisions that then really got the momentum going. And then, of course, once you've started making agreements with these countries, once you've started spending money on the interoperability, then all of a sudden you start to get a sense of people's buy-in to the idea of collective security. You wouldn't be doing all this if you were planning on bailing on it, right? And so the bullet was a kind of crucial first hurdle that opened up this world of interoperability, which remains a field of continual effort in NATO. They're constantly trying to evolve as the weapon systems change. You have to make sure that they're still interoperable with all the other countries. And this 1953 bullet is still the standard round of NATO today. They have another one, which makes me wonder if you can call it the standard round. You have two of them now, but anyway. So let's move on to hierarchy and pouvoir. Now that we've talked about the ways in which these communities can come together through these material negotiations, let's talk about how you can direct some of these energies. So assemblages are marked by heterogeneity and disorder, but that order is produced through processes of self-organization, right? That is to say, bottom-up kind of evolution of things. You can think about markets that way, right? There's, of course, a huge amount of energy and ferment that goes on at the ground level in markets. And then every once in a while, the government or someone tries to step in to steer that energy in particular ways. But there's also, you can't over-dictate that kind of stuff or else you kill the energy at the bottom level, right? So we can think about that also in terms of these diplomacies, right? You need a lot of action at the ground level. So it's important to maintain the balance between self-organization and hierarchy, lest you kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And in Europe, this is a picture of the European External Action Service offices. This is a shift towards pouvoir within the common foreign and security policy. This is a relatively new institution. For most of its history, the European community had no foreign policy. It was left to the individual countries to do. They would get together and have meetings, but only after the actual meetings, right? So the EU or the European communities would have a meeting to talk about, the common agricultural policy and all the stuff that was within the remit. The meeting would end, and then the prime ministers would go to a hotel afterwards and talk about how they might coordinate their foreign policy, right? So, but that was always kind of left very bottom up. If you didn't like it, you didn't have to do it. There was nothing. They just kind of realized they were stronger together. But recently they created the European External Action Service. It's quite controversial. It has its own kind of diplomatic core. It has allowed some European countries to really dial back their diplomatic presence. They act through the External Action Service. Other countries like France and Germany, previously the UK, would maintain their own presence. They saw themselves as kind of too good for this. So we're not entirely sure how it's going to play out in the long run, but it's definitely an effort by the European Union to be a diplomatic actor in a way that it wasn't before. Right? Kissinger famously said, Europe's a great idea, but when there's a problem, who do you call? Right? And so this is an effort to give an answer. Right? There is essentially a foreign ministry of the European Union, although it's explicitly not called that because nobody would like that. Similarly, we have this bottom-up effort in NATO standardization. So the research I did was to kind of interview some people at the NATO standardization office. And standardization in NATO happens through a diplomacy within, right? They have an organization in NATO that negotiates these things. There's one for land forces, there's one for air forces, there's one for naval forces. And those groups negotiate on how weapons or procedures or things ought to be standardized. And then they produce this thing called a STANAG, which is classic NATO. They love acronyms in NATO. It's astonishing. But it's a standardization agreement. And then what happens is those things come out of essentially problems. If somebody is in the field and they're like, hey, this German Jeep drove into our, we'll say Finnish army base and we tried to gas them up, but the nozzle didn't fit. This is a problem. In wartime, this could kill people, right? So somebody files a report, it goes to NATO, they decide what's the kind of cheapest and easiest way to fix this problem, and then it gets agreed. Everyone says, we will now use nozzle 15 for all of our things, right? And then the different armies and navies and so on go out and do it, okay? It's a very efficient process, at least as far as NATO explains it. They might lie to me, but they seem to like it. The problem is it's very bottom up. It's very expensive. If you solve every problem that comes along, right, that's a lot of problems and a lot of money going out the door. And so periodically they've tried to kind of rein this in. And here's hierarchy introducing some things where they would either say, here's a technology coming, like drone technology is a great example. As drones were coming on, they said, we need to get ahead of the game here, right? You don't want to wait until, you're trying to fly your drone and it's making everyone's garage doors open, right? You want to get ahead of that. You want to make sure that you know what's happening. So let's just agree standards on that stuff in advance. And then similarly, they also kind of said, look, you've got to get some of these things approved before we approve them because we're spending too much money, especially at the end of the Cold War. They really slowed down on this stuff. That's the 2000 one. They were kind of like, we can't afford to fix every problem. So, but we can see here where there's an effort to kind of shape the process. There we go. I'm running short on time. I'll tell you what, I'm going to skip this one. This is just an example of intelligence cooperation that's similar. Let me briefly talk about difference here. How can you deal with difference? Actually, I'll skip that one too. Here is here we can talk about NATO standardization and keep the ball rolling there. NATO, of course, has standards for standardization, which is to me the kind of presumably there's somewhere there's standards for standardization. But they argue there's three different ways to achieve standardization. One is compatibility. It just means everything will work. Doesn't matter how standardized it is as long as it works. There's no negative interactions between things. Interchangeability means there's multiple avenues to it. So you might have like adapters, right? Kind of like we have here. Here we have multiple adapters. This is interchangeability. And then you have commonality, which is literally everyone uses the same thing, which is, I guess, where we're headed on USB-C. So there you can accommodate all kinds of things. As long as you say it'll work, that's fine, right? You don't actually have to impose homogeneousness across everyone. And similarly, to get people to go along with it, because it's often expensive, they'll kind of say everyone has to achieve the standard in 10 years. And that way, almost everyone can agree we'll do that within 10 years, because that's someone else's budget sometime down the line when you're no longer in charge. As a head of department, I can say that is a real phenomenon. The longer the deadline, the more likely you are to agree to it, because I'll be out of office. The last bit here, vulnerabilities and capabilities. I love this story. This is the one from the 19th century Foreign Office, right? I talked about future-proofing. The problem they had in the Foreign Office, the Foreign Office used to be in a series of houses opposite 10 Downing Street, which is where the Prime Minister lives. So it was literally across the street. It was 5, later 6 houses, kind of London-style townhouses. And they had knocked holes in the walls to kind of turn them into one big office building. So the party walls all had doors jammed through them. And the rule in the Foreign Office was that you had to have 20 years worth of papers on hand, because they needed to be able to reference all their communications with foreign rulers, or messages that had come in, treaties that had been signed, so that they would know how to respond to anything, right? That was the institutional memory, was all this paper. And so they, unlike a lot of other government bureaucracies, they didn't ship it all out to the state archive, because then they wouldn't be able to get it on a moment's notice. So they waited 20 years and then they shipped that out. But the problem they had at this time was that you had 2 things going on. One, paper was flowing much more easily around the world because of steamships, because of the cheapness now of paper, right? It used to be paper was something you'd scrape ink off of and reuse, right? Now paper is like, chuck it out the window, who cares? And it was easily being mailed around. So you had an increase in the flows. You also had a kind of quadrupling of the number of diplomatic actors in the world. It used to be London was only interested in a few European capitals. But by the mid-1800s, you have most of Latin America independent. You have relations going on with places in East Asia and so on. It's just a bigger diplomatic world. And so the amount of paper coming in every year was magnitudes higher than the paper that was getting shifted out, right? Because the 20 years ago paper would be this much, and this year's paper was like this much, right? And so year on year, the Foreign Office just started filling with paper. And in the testimony, they had the librarian saying that the books are being stacked 3 deep, right? So if you want to, even if you roughly know where the paper is that you're looking for, you have to kind of pull all the volumes out, find it, and so on. Now, remember what I said about the walls. They had cut holes in all the walls and made them all structurally unsound. And then for reasons I don't have time to go into here, they'd put printing presses in the lofts of the building. And the printing press was going kind of 24/7 because it was the confidential printer for the entire British government. When a printing press back then, right, is a big frame that moves back and forth. And so here you have the structurally unsound building stuffed with papers, which is very heavy over time. And you have this big machine on top going back and forth. And so basically the building was crumbling, and they had to start putting struts in the middle of the offices to hold the ceilings up. The doors wouldn't open or close because the door frames had done something wonky. So, and this is a picture from a book I found that shows when they took down the building next to the Foreign Office, and they realized the only reason the Foreign Office was still standing was because it was slouching onto its neighbors. So they had to put these struts up for it. So here you can see where being enmeshed in the diplomatic system, as the UK was, it was very much at the center of the diplomatic system, rendered it vulnerable to these kind of material flows, right? That in a kind of non-human timescale, I mean, it was happening at a human timescale, but you wouldn't notice it year on year, right? But that basically paper was filling this office, and the ability to process paper was becoming a bigger and bigger part of foreign policy or foreign policy making. Let me give you a modern day example from intelligence sharing. In January of 2000, there was a power failure at the National Security Agency in the US, which caused all analysis to be shunted to GCHQ in the UK for 3 days. And GCHQ did not have the computing power to handle all of it. And so huge amounts of data basically just passed out of the system because they can only hold so much data. Much like the Foreign Office had its 20-year rule, by the time we get to 2000, the amount of signals intelligence being collected is so huge, you can only imagine what it is now. They have to start deleting stuff within a few days of receiving it to make room for the next data, right? And so when part of the system went down, basically they were no longer able to listen to anything, and it produced a huge vulnerability. So this picture in front of you is of a NSA data center in Utah, which opened in 2014. Each of those buildings is like the size of several super Walmarts or something like that, if you're interested in Americana. Its estimated storage, of course they won't reveal what it is, it's somewhere between 3 and 12 exabytes of data can be held in that site. And even with that, they have to start deleting it, I think, within a few weeks of receiving stuff, because the data flow has come through. It's like being attached to a fire hose and you're trying to drink from it, right? It's too much. So they have to keep increasing the capacity. And then it's not just how do you store it, how do you actually sort through that for something meaningful, right? And that's the real challenge for a lot of these organizations, hence a lot of the interest in artificial intelligence and things we've been talking about. So to conclude, modestly over time, the kind of key findings that I have in the book are, one, about the underexamined role of basically paper power or bureaucratic power in international relations, right? This is something I think people don't talk about, right? They're happy to talk about, control over oil or how many battalions they have, but actually a huge amount of this is in your kind of bureaucratic state ability to do things. So for instance, in NATO, I think it's something like 90% of the Stanogs have the first draft written by the Americans. And it's basically because they keep volunteering to do it, right? Because they're like, oh, we'll write the first draft, right? We all know the power of the first draft. You get to set the tone. Your standard probably becomes the international standard. Everyone else then adopts the US way of doing it. And that's because they just have a much bigger staff than a lot of the other countries. I think I've shown you, hopefully, some of the ways in which the circulation of materials and affects can shape elite subjectivities. We think about intelligence sharing and the role of that, perhaps, in the war in Iraq, starting that. And one of the things I really liked about this project, besides keeping it interesting for me, was that it was about thinking transversely across multiple assemblages, right? So often when people talk about assemblages, they talk about an assemblage, and they're interested in tracing out that assemblage. And in a way, I guess you could say I did that too, but my assemblage was this like leaderless, amorphous, rhizomatic set of multiple institutions. It just they all happen to have the UK in them, right, in a relatively important role. But essentially, it's kind of like looking at the world of international relations and trying to think about them connected to each other. So those are the things I thought was important then. Since then, I've been watching, as I think we all have, the kind of decoupling of the US and China, and the way that that's in some ways a disarticulating of some of these trends in globalization that that in some ways we're documenting here. And then things like the weaponization of the financial system that we saw with the invasion of Russia, right? Where you can see where the puissance is there, right? You can create this kind of financial system, which then can threaten people. You could say, we can throw you out of SWIFT if you follow these things. I apologize if you're not following all this as closely as I have. But then you do it, right? If you actually weaponize that threat, you kick someone out, then they start to create their own network, right? And other countries might join that network, and your power becomes less because you've actually used it, right? In a lot of ways, the ability to use the power comes from never using it, right? The closer you draw people in, the worse the threat is to cast them out. Then when you've actually cast them out, you have very few kind of carrots and sticks anymore. Well, I guess you still have sticks. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm sorry for going over a few minutes, but I hope we still have some time for discussion. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.